Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today I am joined by the ever wonderful Mr. Thomas 777 to continue our North Africa series, long awaited, but good things come to those who wait. So without any further ado, Mr. Thomas, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for inviting me to do this.
My pleasure. It's always a joy to have you on. But with that being said, let's go ahead and get straight into our topic, because our last stream we discussed some of the birth and ethnogenesis of the tactics that Rommel and some of the famous players who we'll be discussing later used in the North African campaign, and the birth of those tactics in World War I. So I'm going to go ahead and start this stream off with sort of a preamble to why the Afrika Korps and Hitler had to send Rommel to Libya in the first place. And our story begins in 1922. 1922 is when Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini took power in Rome. And one of his main goals was that Mussolini wanted to pursue for Italy was the resurrection of a new Roman Empire, spanning the Mediterranean and Balkan countries. But quickly he realized that England would be a serious obstacle to this goal because England controlled both entrances to the Mediterranean. So for a long time he was kind of stuck there in that predicament. However, Mussolini saw his chance to kind of change the table in 1940 when the Germans defeated France. So he directed his Governor General, Marshal Graziani, in 1940 to direct Libyan forces from West Libya facing the French to face the British in East Libya. And Mussolini's primary order to Marshal Graziani was as simple as this. Mussolini ordered him to attack the British in front of you. And so Marshal Graziani was forced to make a move by early January under pressure from Rome. And Marshal Graziani's 10th Army had 250,000 men, so this wasn't a small force. However, you need to keep in mind, this was a colonial force at best. It was not a fully mechanized, and Italy never had the best military equipment during the Second World War at any given rate, so that's what Marshal Graziani was working with. However, even with these orders, he was pretty slow to advance beyond the Libyan frontier into Egypt. But his men made quick progress, and by January 10th, the Italian 10th Army, at least portions of it, reached 100 kilometers into British Egypt and captured the city of Sidi Barrani on the Egyptian coastline. However, that's quickly when Marshal Graziani and the Italian forces realized there was a major issue. Their supply chains didn't allow them to go any further than that. So Marshal Graziani sat in Sidi Barrani for about 6 months as the British and Allied forces mocked him by calling this a Italian sitzkrieg, as he was just sitting there, because he only ever advanced 100 kilometers into Egypt. That's as far as he went. And so the commander of British Egypt and forces in the Middle East at the time, Sir Archibald Wavell, had a force of just about 86,000 men in total, split between Egypt and Sudan. And he also, you need to keep in mind, he didn't just have to contend with Marshal Graziani's army. He had to contend with Italian forces in Ethiopia, which were about 300,000 men, roughly at that time. And so beyond December 7th, Richard O'Connor and the British High Command under Winston Churchill organized Operation Compass under Richard O'Connor. And by December 7th, they launched an offensive to drive the Italian forces back into Egypt. Drive the Italian forces back into Libya. And they were quite successful. Just to keep you in mind, this is in the wake of also, we need to keep in mind, the Italian disaster in Greece. And so in just 3 days, the Italian forces were forced out of Egypt, and Graziani was forced to defend the town of Bardia on the Libyan frontier, which was quickly besieged on January 5th. And the British 7th Army occupied Bardia on the 5th, and 2/3 of the Italian 10th Army, which numbered 250,000 men, were captured or killed in that battle. After the 7th, The retreating Italian forces quickly made their way to Tobruk. However, again, they were cut off by the British 7th Army, who was fueled by captured Italian fuel when they advanced into Libya. And so by late January, the garrison of 20,000 Italians in Libya in Tobruk were forced to surrender. And things only got worse for Graziani from there. By then, he ordered a full retreat back to Tripoli. And when he was retreating along the Libyan coast, portions of the British 10th Army were sent out ahead of the Italians at the town of Massamurtra and cut them off. And basically, that was the end of Marshal Graziani's force in Libya. And so, with that being said, the situation was very bad for the Italians in Axis, North Africa at that point. The British, under Sir Archibald Wavell, captured all of Cyrenaica at that point, and by that point, Winston Churchill ordered the Australian 10th Army out because they figured the Italians weren't going to launch a major offensive anytime soon. And that's when the OKH and Adolf Hitler decided to make a move to protect their positions in North Africa. And so, Thomas, I'm going to go ahead and give it up to you to sort of take it from there.
Yeah, the problem with the Italians, the problems with the alliance between Germany and Italy. Germany and Italy began as opponents, and people forget that. Hitler and Mussolini became very, very close. I think that Hitler's best ally and the man he most respected as a confidant was Antonescu. But Mussolini was a personal friend. That's why he deployed Scorsese to rescue him, quite literally, from the Alpine Redoubt where he was being held prisoner. Okay, but this idea that the Germans and the Italians were thick as thieves, like the Germans in Croatia, that's not true at all. One of the reasons why, I mean, not to digress too much, but one of the reasons why the situation in the Balkans became so severe, I mean, there's basically a Chetnik coup in 1941, under the auspices of a military emergency, isn't the civil unrest. But Mussolini ordering the assault on Greece when Hitler basically wanted to finesse a political solution there, that caused all kinds of problems. This was a constant thing. And I mean, so why did Hitler feel so indebted to Mussolini? I mean, it's not just because, he revered him because Hitler viewed the National Socialist Revolution as being possible, in part because of the proverbial trail that had been blazed by the Italians. In 1922, it was quite, the March on Rome quite literally was viewed as like returning the Serb, like contra the Bolsheviks, okay? And Italy was an important country. I mean, really until the 70s, I think Italy had like the world's 5th largest economy, okay? So it wasn't viewed as the poor man of Europe. It wasn't viewed as this backwater. It wasn't viewed as just like this kind of magnet for tourist dollars and hedonistic capital. But the situation by 1940, to bring it back, the British had lost the war by that point. After the last British soldier was evacuated from Dunkirk, there was no further contact between the British Army and the Wehrmacht until German forces landed in North Africa. So the British weren't really in the game. One of the reasons they were defending Africa the way they were is because Churchill had to pretend that he was still in the war somehow. I mean, it's this idea that this was some like clutch heroic move, that after the British Army was totally routed, yet Churchill insisted we're going to continue fighting this war. That was irrational on the order of a Zelensky move. It's like, you're not in this war anymore. You just lost this war. But basically, as of 1940, there's a few things happening. it was a key phase in. Well, first I want to get into a bit to the. I want to get a bit into the character of Rommel and like why he was chosen to lead what became the Africa Corps, because that's important. And his character is somewhat misrepresented in the historical record. Okay, you know, Spiedel, Hans Spiedel, who was Rommel's adjutant. Spiedel was like the day one, like Bundeswehr, like commander. Okay, like he was like the first true like European NATO commander. Um, in I mean, obviously, like U.S. Army Europe had overall authority, but NATO was the Bundeswehr, and the the general officers of the Bundeswehr in the immediate aftermath of World War II, these guys had tremendous power. Okay, and Spiedel getting the nod was strange. Okay, because he wasn't denazified. I believe that he lied on Rommel and perjured himself in order to get. I don't think he intended to get Rommel executed, but Spiedel was probably feeding data to OSS or British intelligence, like not out of any. I think he had the soul of a pig. I don't think it was because of any ideological imperative, but this presented uncomfortable questions. Why is Hans Spiedel heading up the Bundeswehr? As the Cold War really set in earnest, it became clear, like, well, you're going to need like former Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS officers to fight World War III. So you better stop talking about it, the devil incarnate, and you probably need to get these guys off death row, because if they're rotting in prison when the Ivans assault the Bundesrepublik, you got a real problem. So a lot of the early historical treatments of Rommel, there's this corny movie called The Desert Fox with James Mason, and he cuts a dashing figure, and he's got like this like leather greatcoat on, and he looks pretty cool. But it's not at all in the movie. Like Rommel's this like anti-Nazi, almost kind of like he almost seems like Robert E. Lee or something. It's ridiculous, and then
Yes, almost a Klaus von Stauffenberg type figure.
yeah, exactly. But Rommel in particular, Rommel was personally close to the Fuhrer. That's one of the ways and I mean, obviously, I don't think that's a negative thing. I hold the Fuhrer in tremendous esteem, as well as Rommel and the entire Third Reich. But so kind of like the rebuttal, as it were, by court historians to a lot of this cap that made Rommel into like the good German. There's this rebuttal where like Rommel was cast as kind of as almost like Ferdinand Schorner or something, this like diehard National Socialist who developed a reputation as fighting a clean war, like owing to propaganda treatments post mortem. That's not true either. But I mean, myself as a historical writer, I tend to follow the examples set by guys like David Irving. I mean, my background was in the law, and when I did practice law, I mostly dealt with post-conviction appeals and things like that. But one puts a premium in those kinds of endeavors on direct testimony. And I think testimony issued forth from a declarant, even if he's not telling the truth, you can discern certain things about his character and his psychological makeup. Okay. So I spent a lot of time with Rommel's personal letters to his wife Lucy and to Manfred Rommel, who was their only son, who he died only a few years back. But Manfred had kind of a tragic life, early life. But Rommel was never home owing to his vocation, but he kept up this avid correspondence. And the kinds of stuff he said to Lucy, because a lot of his letters are preserved incredibly. How they survived the war is anybody's guess, but it's very much a blessing. On literally the day after the onset of hostilities, in September 1939, he wrote this kind of fevered letter to Lucy as he's deploying, to Poland. Quote, he was referring to Hitler's speech to the Reichstag on September 1st. And he says, what do you make of the events of the Fuhrer's September speech? Isn't it wonderful we have such a man? Like he make sure you say a prayer for the Fuhrer every night. Because not only has he reversed the fortunes of our people and saved saved Europe from oblivion, but our personal fortunes, like, we owe to the Fuhrer and his patronage. It's this idea that there was this kind of bad feeling between Rommel and Hitler, or that Rommel was some kind of like anti-fascist, is ridiculous. And of course, part of that too, though, is that part of the ridiculous kind of Nuremberg mythology is that if you were a quote unquote Nazi, like, you spent every waking hour like nourishing like random homicidal impulses towards Jews or something. And like Rommel never talked about Jews like as a people or like as a political quantity, because like, why would he? He was a military man, and he wasn't he wasn't engaged in anti-partisan type activity, and nor was he like part of the security apparatus. So like, why would he care about that? So I mean, anyone who says like, well, what about this conspicuous absence of like racism? It's like, well, that's Hollywood. In the real world, it's not the way people think, and it's certainly not the way. That's certainly not the way a general officer would think. When his country's at war. But and also Rommel too, he was 110% behind. He after he viewed what the Fuhrer did contra Beneš and Chamberlain, as well as cultivating Tiso in the contrivance that was Czechoslovakia. Rommel viewed it as a masterstroke, and he fully supported going to war with Poland. The Poles that were ethnically cleansing Germans, Jews, Russians, anybody they didn't like. It was this crazy military junta. Like, the Germans were outraged at Poland. Like, Poland wasn't this like random country that's like, that was like the Sweden of the Oder or something that just got attacked for no reason. They were a bunch of lunatics. And so Rommel, his correspondence to Lucy and young Manford is like, yeah, we're finally returning to serve. Like, we're going to now be able to defend in depth against the enemy to the east, which is the traditional enemy. Even more so, the threat being exponentially magnified by the onset of the Bolshevik ideological persuasion. But he was 110% behind the war effort against Poland. He's like, these people got to pay. We're going to return to serve. I mean, that's so it's laughable, this idea that he was somehow hostile to the Fuhrer, and he didn't have anything to do with the July 20 plot. As we get into the series further, we'll get into that. We're getting a bit ahead of ourselves to dive too deep into that today, but the fact is, a bunch of real vipers like Spiedel, like Martin Bormann, in my opinion, too, although his motives were different than those of Spiedel and some of these other people who slandered him. Rommel had a lot of enemies because he was in some ways he was the best at what he did. I don't think he was the Reich's best general, but if you're talking about fighting in armor, I think he was probably second to none. And interestingly, that's not how Rommel started out. I think we talked. It's been a minute, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. I think in the first episode we talked about von Seeckt, who was an extraordinary guy because despite being quite elderly by the onset of the Great War, he understood the future of armored combat and like what was becoming combined arms and like mechanized infantry. Rommel wasn't really exposed to that. Like, Rommel's experience of World War I was arguably he was engaged in kind of proto special operations. at squad level. I mean, like as like a Lanzer, but excuse me, he wasn't some cavalry officer who then kind of transitioned to fighting in armor. It's really interesting, and he kind of took to it rapidly. Von Toma was sort of like the first kind of tank prodigy, to emerge within the reconstituted German army. But Rommel really took to it like a fish to water. And when what really kind of what really kind of pinned Rommel's star to the Fuhrer's fortunes, as Hitler viewed it, was what was his performance in Poland. He really, I mean, he held the blue max, the Portland Merit. So I mean, he was a war hero anyway, but that doesn't always translate to command aptitude at company level and beyond. But Rommel, when Rommel's the forces under his command entered Danzig, um, Hitler, he got an audience with Hitler personally for a couple hours. He asked Rommel to brief him personally, and subsequently Hitler visited this port city of Gdynia, and this was really the first time there was an ominous incident. It was chaos because the hostilities had essentially just come to a conclusion. The Fuhrer was visiting this port city, which made it uniquely vulnerable to penetration by hostiles. So security is a major concern. Rommel's kind of trying to like direct traffic accordingly, to maintain situational awareness. Hitler's personal vehicle with his driver and with his bodyguard detail rolls up. Then like a second escort of a a Wehrmacht guard. Then a third vehicle that was carrying Martin Bormann and some other dignitaries. So Rommel says, halt. He's like, nobody's getting through other than the Fuhrer and his security detail. So like Bormann tried to pull rank on him, and Rommel's like, step the fuck down. I don't know where you think you are. I'm in command here. Your party rank means nothing to me. And and Rommel humiliated him. And Bormann was a piece of shit. And he was the kind of man who cultivated grudges. Like he wasn't a punk. Like he was a killer. Like he rose to the party ranks because he whacked a guy who was affiliated with the militia that had murdered Horst Wessel. That's not specifically why he killed him, but like Bormann had like gone to the dude's house and whacked him like in his home. So he wasn't like a punk or like a I mean, he wasn't like a military type, but he wasn't a coward or anything like that. But he was just an incredibly shitty guy, and that Bormann never forgot that.
No, I think even when Heinrich Himmler is cautious of you, it's for a good reason.
No, indeed. And unfortunately, I mean, Bormann was something of a savant, and people don't. This is a bit of a tangent, but before there was even like the most primitive like word processors, if you had a man who could literally like basically like remember everything in terms of like data like minutia, you could ask him to like produce like a piece of paperwork and he knew where it was immediately. Like you needed that. So I mean, it didn't. you know, when people complain about Bormann, you know, about he's a bastard, like I can't stand that man. Like Hitler would be like, well, I need him. You know, you got a better man who can do what he does. Like I'm welcome to, you know, give him a opportunity to fulfill the role. But be as it may, I mean, this I'm emphasizing this stuff because again, you know, like just for like day one context, you know, Rommel was close to the Fuhrer. He was close to the inner core of the National Socialist Party. You know, and he knew that the Polish campaign was a Rosenkrieg. You know, and again, like I'm not putting shade on Rommel. I've got no problem with if it was a Rosenkrieg. I mean that's the reality of what World War II was. That doesn't somehow make the Third Reich evil or something like that. But again, the way this kind of bizarre minuet, where court historians claim that the Third Reich was just unconscionably evil, but then there were key figures in the military establishment who just like didn't know about these purported bad things. You know, Rommel, he knew that there was masses of Polish like partisan types, intellectuals, you know, who were just being whacked. And his wife's uncle, he was some professor type. I think he was half Polish, half Volksdeutsch, but Lucy like asked Rommel to see, you know, make sure he was okay. So like Rommel puts in a call to Himmler, I think like May of 1940. And it was clear that the guy had been like instrumentally whacked or like disappeared. You know, so like Rommel, he gives his wife this kind of like non-answer, saying like I think he wrote to her like, obviously the vagaries of war have brought your uncle to misfortune. So I mean he knew what was going on. Like whether you're talking about what was happening in Pinkville in Vietnam, whether you're talking about, you know, the ROE and the kind of categorical violence between populations, which went both ways on the Ostfront, whether we're talking about Poland or whether we're talking about in the Soviet Union. There's no way you're like a general officer if you have like no knowledge of these things. Like how would that even be possible? But you know, it's the Rommel moving ahead. You know, it wasn't really until February 1940 that Rommel, the kind of like combined arms prodigy as we know him, like kind of came into existence. You know, before that, he would have viewed himself as an infantry commander. You know, and he certainly Rommel commanded armor in Poland, but not like as a dedicated element. And combat against the Polish army, there's a lot of misconceptions about like the Polish army. They weren't charging panzers on horses or whatever these fucking idiots claim. I don't even know where that fucking came from. But and they weren't like total shit either. I mean, like Poland was a mess at that time. This junta was incredibly corrupt. But they performed basically as well as can be expected. And like Poles aren't pussies; they're pretty tough people, you know. But it wasn't really an armored fight. I mean, yeah, like the German doctrine, German battlefield doctrine is always like about the advance of fire. So like they were rushing firepower to the front to like hose down the Poles. But you know, it's not like the Poles were like fielding like, you know, tank killing like mobile artillery or something. Or so it's not like the Poles are like throwing like T-34s at the Panzers, you know. So it's a different kind of thing. But
no, I believe the main Polish armored vehicle they had was the Italian tankette, basically.
Yeah.
With a machine gun. No, a 12 millimeter autocannon, which is...
Yeah.
Well, you do have to have some balls to drive that thing against Panzer Is for Panzer IIs.
I'm saying it's asinine when people say like Polish cavalry was like charging armor. It's like nobody would do that. It's not. I mean, it's just like retarded. But it's no. The Poles were game, man. Like I said, they fought basically as well as can be expected. But in February 1940, like Rommel, he was assigned to the 7th Panzer Division, and Rommel was remarkable in the kind of psychological effect that he had on enlisted people. And the significance of that can't be overstated. Like Sepp Dietrich didn't have the conventional military aptitude that Rommel did, but it's the same kind of deal. Like Sepp Dietrich, like really, really animated his people. And like morale, it's not just a huge force multiplier like when it's popping, but the absence of it is catastrophic and fatal. His first act, he set the regimental commanders, and these guys had cut their teeth in Poland. He sent them on leave, and said, I got to learn the ropes myself. I'm not going to be having you run around having to, where I'm tempted to delegate, number one. Number two, he's like, you guys have been working hard for this division, for months. And some cases years. He's like, take a break, you deserve it. Every morning at dawn, Rommel would engage in like PT. He'd go running. Rommel fell very sick by 1941, and he started having heart problems and other stuff. But by this point, like, he was committed. I think he was 44 at this time. He didn't want to become some like just flabby officer, like some of the men respected him because, like when at revelry they'd see General Rommel like doing his own PT.
He would recon the front himself with his men in force.
Yeah, and he understood cartography and geography very well. And it generally doesn't. I see the example of Courtney Hodges. That's catastrophic. But Rommel was particularly good at this, and he obviously enjoyed it. And if you don't have like kind of like a savant's passion for that stuff, like you're not gonna be able to motivate yourself to do it. But Rommel also was like hard as fuck as a disciplinarian. About a week after he arrived, some battalion commander, he considered him like unsatisfactory. So within like 90 minutes of meeting the guy, like he sent him packing. Like it got around that like if you were not squared away, like you would be rapidly fucking fired and like demoted and like sent packing. And then like in the German army, whether you're talking about the army of the Kaiserreich, or whether you're talking about like the Interwar Reichswehr, or whether you're talking about the Wehrmacht, like promotions came very, very slowly, especially in the combat arms. Your reputation, it wasn't like your personnel file like in these overly bureaucratized contemporary armies. Like your reputation was everything. So like if a fighting general with clout is like, this guy's a shitbag, you're basically finished. So I mean, it was Rommel developed a rep as a guy who was like unbelievably motivated, like always positive, always on target. But he had like he had the sensibility of a Prussian martinet, in terms of disciplining people who were not pulling their weight. But he didn't fuck with like pointless regulations and like authority for its own sake. So he was really he really was a remarkable guy. Interestingly, Rommel was very much he was very much being monitored. Okay. A guy named Karl August Hank was assigned to Rommel's staff very suddenly. And Hank was he'd been a senior aide to Goebbels at the propaganda ministry. And he was assigned as a lieutenant to Rommel's staff. So Rommel put him he put him in the Panzer IV was new then. So Rommel assigned him to a Panzer IV and said anybody on my staff has got to know how to fight in armor. You know, they also sent him. There was a corporal, and in the Wehrmacht at that time, like a senior corporal would be in the role we think of as a staff sergeant. You know, and like a staff sergeant or a sergeant was often a platoon leader, and a lieutenant would be in the role of like company commander. I'm speaking in terms of equivalent ranks. But this senior corporal who'd been on the editorial staff at der Stürmer, you know, like he showed up assigned to 7th Panzer. So it's like obviously, you know, Rommel was a rising star. Some guys in the party apparatus, they were taking these like very hardline National Socialists were basically like, you know, keep an eye on the general. You know, like if something seems like not right, or if he's, you know, if he seems to not be abiding political doctrine. Now, like mind you, like you didn't have to like you didn't have to insinuate National Socialist ideology like into like your in like in you know in like daily briefings or something. But and I mean German officers actually had a hell of a lot of freedom. I mean the entire ethos of the German army is mission-oriented tactics. But I think Hitler never trusted the army, and for good reason. I mean, they tried to murder him later. But and in turn, like the party never really trusted the army. But it's interesting, you know, and this kind of raised eyebrows among you know, like the military careerists, like in Rommel's orbit. But I don't read that itself as like a sinister harbinger. I think that was because Rommel was a rising star, and
he definitely had his detractors in the OKH for sure. I think one of the most famous examples was Franz Halder, who personally hated Rommel and tried to sabotage him at every single opportunity he get. It's the reason why the Afrika Korps is named the Afrika Korps and not the Rommel Corps. It's because of him.
Right, and I think he probably denounced him to the SD, and that was one of the reasons why Rommel was forced to commit suicide. But point being too, so keep in mind, you know, the Third Reich wasn't this mirror image of the Soviet Union. You know, there's this constellation of power bases, some of which preceded, you know, the party by centuries. You know, some of which were relatively recent in absolute historical terms, innovations of kind of the Bismarckian state. You know, there wasn't. It's not like the National Socialists, you know, killed 10 million of their own people. You know, eliminated any basic capital or independent authority outside of themselves, and you know, they had the entire country locked down like the Soviets did. Like they didn't at all. And like where party authority ended, and you know where the authority of you know the landed aristocracy began, particularly the guys who had, you know, general officer commissions to buttress that land and title, you know, the that degree to which, you know, the party could be legally insinuated into what were formally, as a matter of law, like organs of state that were you know, by constitution as well as custom, you know, declared to be apolitical. You know, it was the party was constantly trying to quash threats to it in the nascent stage, because the threats to it were actually myriad. You know, and they didn't have absolute power to do whatever the hell they wanted. I mean, like Hitler was incredibly popular. You know, the party was not. You know, so there's that too. Like people weren't Germans weren't all going around saying like we love the National Socialist Party. They were saying we love Hitler. And if you ask them how they felt about the party or the SD, or they probably, I mean, speaking if they were in friendly environs, they'd probably say not very flattering things about it. It'd be like, like people like regular American people and like American yeomanry loved Andrew Jackson. They didn't love the U.S. government. I mean, it's the same thing. Like however like based or whatever people think the Nazi Party was, it was still like a political party. It was full of like bureaucrats like Martin Bormann. Like it's like any political party at scale, particularly if it's either like if it's either like the ruling element or like the dominant faction in a constellation of ruling elements, like they're gonna be fucked up in the way that like governments always are. So that's important to consider too when we're dealing with like some of these like proverbial palace intrigues. But
I do want to touch on something just really quickly. The reason, going back to the Italians, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this stream, the reason they had a very poor reputation, especially among the average German soldier, was not only the fact they lost in Libya in 1940 so completely, it was also just the debacle in Greece, which was a major catastrophe for Italy and a major blow. And even Hitler said after that the alliance with Italy may have been a mistake, something along those lines, when they had to come bail them out, essentially.
Well, also, I mean, it shouldn't have the assault on Greece shouldn't have happened. I mean, that was I mean, Italy. The Third Reich needed Italy, and particularly, I mean, look, like Hitler was personally loyal to a fault. Okay, I'm speaking in political terms. I don't mean morally. That's not a fault. You being loyal in the way he was, but Dollfuss was whacked by the Austrian National Socialists, like literally as Hitler was meeting with Mussolini and the Italian delegation. And Dollfuss and Mussolini were thick as thieves. The fact that the Italians didn't assault to prevent the Anschluss was a miracle. Especially after, the Austrian National Socialists had literally whacked what amounted to the Italians' client in Vienna. I mean, if like Mussolini made the National Socialist Revolution possible, in key capacities. And plus too, it's I mean, even during the Cold War, like NATO, like when Italy was a key aspect of they were a key component of NATO war doctrine. Not just because that they were a basing hub for theater nuclear weapons, but I mean they were the Italians took up the southern flank just as the Benelux and the UK took up defense of the North German plain. So I mean, you can't get away. Italy remains an important country. Back to so in Rommel, when he arrived at 7th Panzer, there was, I guess we consider, so it's kind of like at Van, WAHN, training ground. This is where armored maneuvers were held. So day after day, like Rommel was observing these armored exercises and kind of realizing like what was possible in armor. Okay, and he was getting when he first arrived, about half the tanks that 7th Panzer had were Czech built, were soon to be obsolete Czech built platforms. The best tanks he had were Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, and the Panzer IV was brand new then. I think the Panzer III ran on gasoline, not diesel, and that made it dangerous to cruise because it would combust. When it got hit, it would explode. And burning to death in a tank is like my worst nightmare. I could never fight in armor. Like my room 101 terror is being burned to death.
Oh,
And
not also to mention the fact if your tank gets hit by an anti-tank round, it doesn't even have to blow up your tank to kill you. The
oh
shrapnel
yeah,
from the shell can literally peel off pieces of the armor and rip you apart.
no, I got mixed feelings about that film Fury, but one thing that's good about it is how gory, like where they're the dudes like hosing out the Sherman tank, and there's like pieces of some poor guy's head in there. Like if you get hit in a tank, you get like torn to pieces. You get like a face full of steel, and it basically like tears you apart. But it but Rommel he was realizing what was possible in terms of the platform, and people didn't even really. One of the reasons why the Italians were getting smoked, they didn't even they Garibaldi, I think, who was Graziani's successor, he claimed that he didn't even think heavy armor could drive on sand. He's like, I'm not even going to try it because he's like, if you try and deploy a heavy tank platform out in the desert, you'll just get stuck, which was bullshit. I mean, obviously, like the whole point of a tank is that like you can move over sand, or I mean, basically anything other than like wetlands, you know, a heavy. I mean, there are no more heavy tanks. There's only main battle tanks, but in those days, a heavy tank could absolutely drive on sand. And I don't even think Garibaldi wasn't just being like a cliched kind of lazy subpar officer. I think he probably had no idea, what the real capabilities and shortcomings and utile aspects of armor were.
And
Like
he
why.
really echoes like the Italian leadership during the Second World War, and even you could say even the First World War to a lesser extent as well, where
I
the
think the
men may
Italians
be
did something.
brave, but their generals are lazy and unimaginative.
I mean, there was a crony aspect to the Kingdom of Italy. The Italian Waffen SS was game, and the Italians who volunteered to fight in the Ostfront. I mean, they fought hard. I think plus two, there was about. I'll get there in a minute. Um, I realize we're running out of time for today, but there was about 220,000 Italian forces in being in theater in North Africa. Contra about 200,000 Allied forces. Those are not good odds. Ideally, you want to outnumber your defender, like in a perfect world. You want to outnumber the defender about 3-1. I mean, you definitely want to be able to ratio him by about 50%. I mean, so essentially that's like exact parity. And arguably the Italians were outgunned in terms of firepower. So I mean, I think Graziani was a shitbird, but even if he wasn't, like I don't blame him for not, going on the assault with what he had. Especially when you consider that logistical chains of supply were unreliable on their best day. But for context too, to bring it back, as Rommel was observing these tank exercises, to give people an idea, a Panzer III or a Panzer IV, they weighed 20 tons. They were like just shy of like 9 feet tall. They had a 5-man crew. Top speed. A Panzer III with a gasoline engine, I think at a top speed of about like 25 miles an hour. Okay, so this is like as low tech gets. I mean, you've got a very powerful main gun, but you're basically looking at like a main gun. You're basically looking at like a primitive bulldozer, just like a powerful like main gun like mounted to it. Like you don't. the ability to maneuver in these things, the ability to direct firepower, in concert with the infantry without getting everybody killed. It's not an easy thing to do. You know, Rommel beefed up his learning curve. He started taking platoons of 7th Panzer like across the country, like large and small formations, like experimenting on different terrain, like practicing like radio procedures, practicing gunnery, practicing like fighting at night like in armor. You know, it he was constantly taking notes. He was constantly, devising remedies to what didn't work. He was constantly, crafting ways to multiply, force in what did work. It and eventually he did so well at this. Herman Hoth, who was a senior to Rommel, he commanded 15th Corps, which within its order of battle had 7th Panzer as well as 5th Panzer. Hoth had been awarded the Knight's Cross in Poland, and like Rommel liked him and respected him. Like Rommel was a Swabian, he was kind of a cantankerous dude, frankly. Like he had a sense of humor, but like famously like when Rommel was in France, that summer was extraordinarily hot. So there was like these like young fifis who like stripped down like their bras and panties and were like sitting out on their balconies, and like Rommel, like the only thing he said about like the only time any of his men heard him mention women at all was like he said that like they were annoying. And like he yelled at them to like go back inside or something. It was like he was but he wasn't like a humorless guy, but he was very much though like he was very much like a cantankerous motherfucker, like very, very hard dude. And he just like didn't get along with a lot of people. But he and Hoth were they were genuinely friends. And so this was it was Hoth's 15th Corps was the Schwerpunkt of 4th Army, like an element of 15th Corps was, which was von Kluge. And von Kluge was a legendary Prussian officer type, as was his whole family, a very proud lineage. But that's where are we at here? I'm just checking. Like I got kind of like a rough outline of stuff that I think we should cover.
I did want to mention something real quick. The reason why Rommel's division in France got the nickname the Ghost Division was because they just couldn't keep up with him because he kept moving so far past the front line. They didn't know where he was.
Yeah.
And that's where his nickname of the Ghost, Commander of the Ghost Division comes from in France.
Oh yeah, and one of the ways the party came to kind of back off and decide he was all right, despite his combative nature, to be charitable with them, was that he presented great propaganda opportunities. He'd get these glowing write-ups in the Vogelschrift Beobachter. He'd get there'd be like movie reel shot of him where he was cast as this like dashing figure. And Rommel was like he wasn't conventionally handsome and he was a short dude, but he looked like a soldier. Like he almost looked like he almost looked like an eagle or something. Like he's an interesting guy. But they came back again and again to Rommel as as this kind of like liminal figure almost. And plus too, people don't understand. I mean, I'm always trying to explain to people. I mean, this should be obvious, but I mean, there's like a cultivated ignorance in this country, I think, about like war and peace matters. Like modern combat resolves rapidly. Like the French aren't like a bunch of pussies who surrendered. Like the Wehrmacht ate like I think like 40,000 KIA. That's fucking crazy in a few weeks. Fighting the French, like you don't, there's not like stalemates. When you're talking about modern combined arms warfare, like basically like never happen. So I mean the fact that the French ultimately got routed, I mean that happens. And that by relevant metrics, it wasn't a particularly one-sided campaign. I mean, yeah, it was like a great German victory, but it's not. The French were considered to be probably like the best, like after the Wehrmacht, they're considered to be like their most like high speed and most capable like probable opponent. So that was like no small thing. Especially after Rommel like scored these big victories as with a company level command in Poland, and then he basically duplicates his successes, but at even greater scale in the West. Yeah, forgive me if this is like too conversational. We haven't caught up for a minute, and there's a lot of things I wanted to address. We can I'll be more disciplined about progressing the narrative like next time we convene, and we'll probably have to go to a part 4, like a part 3 and part 4, if that's agreeable. We can go for longer next time. I'm leaving for Portland in a week. I'm trying to catch up on a bunch of stuff. I gotta have some kind of workable version of this manuscript so I can begin submitting it. I'm trying to bang that out. So, but we can go when I get back from Portland. We can go for like 90 minutes or so, or maybe even 2 hours if that's what's clever. But yeah, I hope this was fruitful nonetheless.
No, it was really good. I really enjoyed it. I think we've progressed to a good enough point to get people caught up again to where we are in the narrative. But let's answer some questions in the chat before we get out of here, Mr. Thomas. So, from Hunger the Die Merchant, catching up, but what was Germany's grand strategy in Africa? Just ejecting the British?
Well, the thing is this. To my comrade here's point, Mussolini actually initially, like the Italian army, they were too proud to ask for help in Africa, but then when it was clear they were going to be routed, they started begging the German High Command, to commit forces, and Hitler was still pretty upset with what the Italians had done, in Yugoslavia, in Greece, in Libya. So he was only willing to commit one Panzer division. But when Rommel got there, he basically, like, the mission parameters were basically like prevent the Italians getting routed, but he performed so well. And again, despite the cap about like Germans like only following orders, like that's total bullshit. Like mission-oriented tactics, that's like day one German army stuff. So basically, you're a general officer, you deploy in theater, you're basically told, okay, identify like what the probable odds of victory are, like identify like what objectives are possible, and like establish like mission parameters therein. So like Rommel basically decided, like, okay, I can beat the British army. They've already lost this war. Let's just like kill them in Africa and take everything. So that's what it became. Rommel's like, we're gonna take what was like Ottoman North Africa. We're gonna try and get the Iraqis to revolt. And further kind of put the nail in the coffin of the empire, and then like take everything. So that's what it became.
Yeah, it has to be said again. The Suez Canal was as important as your heart, basically, of the British Empire. And if the Germans managed to cut that off, basically, that would cut off India and the eastern colonies of the British Empire, which supplied huge amounts of raw material and manpower to keep the British war effort going.
Well, yeah, and it's
Not
also too. I mean, like I said at the outset, like Britain had lost World War II by this point. It's like so there was a certain like irrationality to it. It's like, okay, so you guys are just gonna like fight tooth and nail for Africa and refuse to make peace just because like there was something totally self-defeating about it. So the editor from Berlin from day one was like, "Are you guys ever gonna stop this? Like, why exactly are you waging this anti-fascist suicide jihad on us? Like that question was never answered. Like by anybody in authority. It was so that was part of it too. It's like, you're basically like you're gonna force us to keep killing you because to make a point. There was a naked irrationality to it that's rare.
Yeah, and that goes back to Winston Churchill, which is a
Oh yeah,
conversation of himself,
yeah,
that guy. But I just want to mention this quick point before we head off today. When Rommel arrived in North Africa with his one light division, 'cause that's all he had at the time, as I mentioned, the British controlled all of Cyrenaica basically at that point. And his orders were basically, his purpose was to be a blocking force to prevent the
yeah.
British advancing to like Tripoli and like advancing all the way to Tunisia at that point.
And
Because
then
keep
it
in
wasn't.
mind, if the British controlled all of Libya, they would be able to use the airfields there to bomb Germany's, oil fields in Romania and Hungary, and also to attack like industrial targets in Germany and Italy. So it
Well,
was
yeah,
very important that like
yeah.
Italy not just lose Libya.
No, and one Panzer division wasn't adequate, so Rommel got reinforcements, and thus like the Africa Corps. But then it became
But he
I
was
mean,
so
you can't really
successful that it became a grand offensive strategy.
yeah. Well, you can't. I mean, fighting in the desert is the closest. It's the closest scenario in land warfare to naval combat. It's really weird, and but it's also. I mean, you can't. You can't deploy as a true like blocking element in the desert anyway, but you certainly can't with like one division and like armored divisions are. I mean, Wehrmacht divisions were like undersized by like NATO or Warsaw Pact standards, or like what was NATO and Warsaw Pact standards that like we're habituated to do. And like an armored division too, like it's not fucking 10,000 men, So I mean, people got to consider that as well.
Definitely, and I think we'll go on from that point. But Thomas, it was great having you on, and I think we'll continue on to part three from that point. Is there anything you'd like to shill or spread to the people today before we close out the stream?
I think people know pretty well where to find me at this point. I mean, I'm pretty active on Substack all the time, and that's kind of where you can glean like substantive stuff that I'm up on. It's realthomas777.substack.com. We're going to Confederate Mound at Rosewood Cemetery on the south side this Saturday, and there should be a good turnout. But if you want to come, it'd be at Rosewood Cemetery. It's on 67th Street. Be there at 11:30. Go to my Substack. You'll find all the information there. You can find me on Twitter. Same alt I've had since January 2023. I'm on Telegram. I'm on Instagram. I'm all over the fucking place, man. Like I got on my social media, like I've got a post pinned that has like all my platforms. But yeah, just go to the Substack if you kind of want to be advised of like what we're doing like day to day and week to week.
All right, with that being said, thank you all for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. If you did enjoy this stream, please like and subscribe as it helps out my channel tremendously. And remember, everyone, keep heart. We're going to win this. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.